Hey guys, this is Miss Arlequin, and in this video we are going to be planning our responses and our evidence for our Unit 6 performance-based task. Alright, so our learning target for today is to plan out the details for our essay, and we'll know we've achieved this learning target with 4 criteria for success. Criteria 1, I can choose which strategies my chosen writers used. Number 2, I can find evidence of each strategy. Number 3, I can determine each writer's perspective. And number 4, I can explain how the use of the given technique helped to convey their perspective. So there's really a lot that we're going to have to do to really achieve this learning target and to write really effective essays. So we know that for this task, our assignment is to really talk about author's perspective and author's techniques. So our task reads, these writers claim a specific vision of what it means to be an American. Compare and contrast their perspectives, referencing their literary devices and their figurative language. So whenever we have any kind of essay task, the most important thing that we want to start off with is we want to start off by taking the task and turning them into questions for us to answer. The reason I like to turn the task into questions is because questions give you something very specific to focus on, and they can actually be an excellent tool for your writing. For example, when we write short response paragraphs, we're writing in response to a question. We then use the question as our opening topic sentence. We restate and answer the question. That gives us the first sentence of the paragraph, and it also gives us our claim for that paragraph. So if we can do that in an essay, if we can take the task and turn it into questions, we can then turn our body paragraphs into really straightforward short responses. So it's almost like a technique that you can use to make essay writing easier for yourself. So what kind of questions would we be able to take this task and turn them into? You really want to think about questions that kind of break down the task into smaller pieces. So like, what kind of questions do you have to answer in order to achieve this task? Always start off by trying to think about the 5 W's. Do you have a what question that needs to be answered in order to achieve this task? Do you have a where or when or a why or a how question? All right, so when I turn this into questions, I've got which writers am I going to write about? What is this writer's perspective on being American? How do I know that this is their perspective? And what literary technique is the writer using here? So once again, I'm going to use these questions to help guide the writing of my body paragraphs. All right, so now what literary techniques have we noticed the unit writers using during our close readings? For this task, we're really focusing on just the first 3 poems that we read, and then also we can use the poem Harlem, aka A Dream Deferred. So we want to use I Hear America Singing by Walt Whitman. We can choose I Too, or we can choose Harlem, A Dream Deferred. And we can also choose Julia Alvarez, I Too Sing America. What techniques do we know for a fact these writers have used? All right, so if I think about the writer's toolbox, and I use that kind of as my guide, I know that the authors have used figurative language. I know that Langston used dialect. I know that there are sound devices being used in these poems, like assonance and consonants. I also know that there is, let's see, structure. Well, we talked about structure with Be Real Cool. Could I talk about structure when I talk about some of these poems? Sure, I could probably talk about structure in I Hear America Singing. But even more importantly, if I go back to sound devices, we could really talk about repetition. Many of the poets use repetition. Julia Alvarez uses diction. Diction should be up here. She has Spanish and English words. That's a technique. She's using it to convey a specific message and her perspective. And of course there are other ones, but just to get us started, those are some of the techniques that the poets use. All right, so now we're ready to start planning. Your first step is to choose which poems and poets you're going to be comparing and contrasting. You really only need to choose 2. You're choosing poet number 1 and you're comparing it with poet number 2. You then need to determine which techniques you want to write about. You need at least one technique that they've both used so you have a point of comparison. And you need at least one technique that is different, so you have a point of contrast. That's the minimum that you need for this assignment. Achieving the minimum, of course, is just so you're meeting the standards, but if you want to exceed those standards, then you're going to want to look for maybe multiple techniques for comparison and multiple techniques for contrast. All right, so far we've looked at a model essay for this task, and I'm actually going to be using that student's model essay to model the planning chart for you. Now, that student used the poem One Today by Blanco and I Too Sing a Mara by Alvarez for their comparison and contrast. So the first thing that that student would have done, just for some brainstorming, is they would have made a double bubble map. We know that double bubble maps are used to compare and contrast. The bubbles in the middle are the similarities, and then the bubbles on the side are the contrasting, the things that are different. So Richard Blanco used simile and sensory details, which is a little different from Julia Alvarez. Even though a simile is figurative language, and Julia Alvarez also used figurative language, her figurative language is a little different. She used personification. And another difference is her use of Spanish words, which we can refer to as part of the category diction. It's word choice. But then the similarity is that they both use repetition. And so in that essay, the model student decided to compare their use of repetition and then contrast the items of simile, personification, and then sensory details in Spanish words. All right, so for our model essay planning chart, and it's the same planning chart that you guys are going to be using for your essays, you're going to put the text title, where it says text title. You're going to identify the literary technique or figurative language that's being used. In this case, I'm starting out with the poem One Today, and I'm starting out with repetition. You're then going to talk about how the author used this technique to convey their perspective. So here you really want to put what their perspective is. How does Richard Blanco feel about America and being an American? So he is one American among many in one country. He thinks that he's just one single voice, but that there are many, many voices in the country of America. You then want to find your text evidence, and that's going to go into this column here. Once you have your text evidence, and again, this is text evidence that shows your technique, but also shows this perspective. Now, we've talked about this in class, that you can have an author using a technique, but that technique might not be showing the key idea that you're looking for. In this case, you need to find evidence that shows the author's perspective, and then from that perspective, it also has to be the use of a certain type of technique. If there was an example of repetition somewhere in the poem that didn't show how Richard Blanco feels about being an American, then that wouldn't be an appropriate piece of evidence to choose for this particular essay. So I put my text evidence here, and then I'm going to explain the evidence. How do I know that this is an example of the technique I've identified? How do I know that this is repetition? So this could be you can almost say that sometimes this is like stating the obvious, especially for this. How do I know it's repetition? Because he's repeating the word one. It's like so obvious, but you just want to make sure that you are explaining it. This is also going to be a way for your partners and myself to know that you really do understand the technique and you're able to explain how an author's using it. And then here, this is where we're elaborating on the technique. Again, remember our goal. Our goal is to explain how the use of these techniques are helping the poet develop their perspective or convey their perspective. So this strategy is helping the writer convey his perspective because how? How is the use of repetition, repeating the word one, helping Richard Blanco show us, the reader, that he's just one American among many? So I wrote that it helps emphasize his vision that all people in this land are Americans. All right, so you're going to keep doing that on your planning chart. Remember, this is one technique. I need to have another technique, at least one other. And so you can see on the model planning chart that there is the example for similes. And it's following the same format. You identify the technique, you identify the perspective, you give the evidence, you explain the evidence, and then you elaborate on the evidence. All right, so now it's time for you to work independently. You are going to choose your authors, your poets, You're going to create a double bubble map where you brainstorm the compare and contrast elements. So what are the techniques that are similar? What are the techniques that are different? And then you're going to use that to start working on your planning chart. Remember that all of the copies of the poems are available in the Google Drive student resource folder, also in the Edmodo folder. Some poems you do already have copies of. They should be in your binder. If these techniques are not the ones you want to write about, please feel free to write in what technique you want to use. Make sure that your entire chart is completed. If there is not enough space in your planning chart, please use Post-it notes to add additional sentences or explanations. And if there's not enough boxes because you want to do more techniques for the poets, please just continue either on loose leaf paper and draw the boxes yourself, or you can print out another copy of the planning chart from, again, either Edmodo or the Google Drive student resource folder. Make sure your planning charts are ready for tomorrow's class, where we're going to share with our partners and we're going to evaluate our planning charts before we start drafting.